It's a great pleasure to be here and to have such a warm welcome. And I particularly also want to stress that I did indeed spend, nearly 20 years living in Wales and just across the water. And in my time there, I think particularly the thing I found most rewarding was working with local groups such as the one here, who are trying to bring their heritage not only into a scholarly framework, but also particularly into one that connects with tourism, heritage tourism, development of education, all of these things in a connected up kind of way. And that's a journey I've been on the other side of the Irish Sea that's very connected here, of course. And so the pleasure of these events, especially that interface with so many other dimensions of scholarship than just simply the academic ones, and that's what makes it really worthwhile. My particular brief is to talk about St. David, and I lived for many years in the Diocese of St. David, and with St. David's on my doorstep, and its links, David, and his links particularly to Ireland, or the way in which particularly the life of St. David and the cult of St. David link with Ireland, and particularly this part of Ireland. But also I think the brief I have also is really talk a bit about how we know about these kind of topics. I mean, how do we know about saints? How does a beetle fall on me there from the roof? It's all right, I'm an Australian, I'm not bothered by bugs. And how we know about saints and how we use information about saints to create stories, if you like, or narratives, heritage narratives, literary narratives, whatever they may be. Now, one word of warning I'll give you from the beginning is when you're dealing with the early Middle Ages, you are rarely dealing with connected up stories upon which you can rely. Most of these stories are in some way or other transmitted at different times to the period. They're handed down the line. They're often changed by the politics of the eras that come after their initial writing, or they may be written in those eras about the earlier era. And often what you need in a way to think about is how you make narratives out of things that are not really narratives, often out of materialities, literary allegories, things of that sort. So you've got to sort of in a way be prepared for the fact that the task is not just reading a story, but it's finding a story out of other stories. It's a forensic exercise, if you like. Okay, our two saints, just briefly, that we're going to talk about here. One problem with saints is they often go under many names as well. You know, it's another forensic problem. I'm sure the police could tell you all about these sort of problems as well. People who travel under different names. David, or Dewi Sant, as he's known in Wales, I beg your pardon, and also here, St. Aidan, or Aidan, or Máedóc, spelled in Máedóc there. These characters are our two protagonists who are going to link my story. Both of them come from the 6th into the 7th century AD. David died either in 689 or 601. This is a problem of reconciling dates in the annal collections. So he might have died in the 7th century, but only just. Máedóc, as I will know him, a saint born in County Cavan, but the founder of the Monastery of Ferns upon this site. He died probably in the 620s, but there is some problems about reconciling his life, as we'll see. When saints lived and died, the things that were remembered about them were often, we might call a sort of suitcase of facts. So where they founded monasteries, the day of the year on which they died, what's known as the feast day. Some of those things are facts that are probably fairly reliable. Often the year in which they die is harder to get right. Another problem with also saints is you have sometimes saints with very similar names, and also particularly a tendency in Ireland to augment the names with these suffixes and prefixes. So St. Aid or St. Ed becomes Máedóc, the Mo being an affectionate prefix my, the og becoming a diminutive suffix, so essentially my little Ed, I suppose, really, or something like that. But really it's a way of showing affiliation, so the saint becomes your saint, and the saint becomes a saint who is dear to you, so they get this sort of pet name as well. But this can lead to some saints with the same names or similar names being conflated together, and we do think that's probably the case with St. Máedóc, who's conflated with another saint. So we end up with a different obit. He may have died in 627 or in 659, but whether there are two saints or whether there's just some muddling of the facts, these are problems that, well, we could be here all day, but sufficient for now. Now, the life of St. David was written around about 1085 at a monastery, or a church anyway, a religious community in Ceredigion in Wales. I'll show you that on a map in a moment. And it was written probably, I should note, in response to Norman interests in Wales. William the Conqueror had visited St. David's in 1081, and the author of the life of St. David, Crigavach, was actually the son of the Bishop of St. David's, so there's probably a very particular political context there. The first life of St. Máedóc, which is in British Library manuscript Cotton Vespasian, I love these emperors' names that get into these, Vespasian 14. This one, possibly originally written in Irish. I've got my doubts about this theory, but another time. But it's in a Latin form now. That one probably written about 1060, sometime in the mid-1000s. Now, my first point simply here is to say any historian confronted with the story of a saint who lived maybe in the 500s, but whose earliest life comes from the 1000s, might reasonably ask the question, what are we actually doing here? I mean, is this text anything really to do with history? Well, that doesn't make it uninteresting as a text necessarily, but we have to have some scepticism about whether all the material we have in it is really immediate to the saint. But there's another problem here as well, because people don't write about saints necessarily to convey historical facts. They're not necessarily writing not to convey historical facts, but the first point about a saint's life is it's meant to be edifying. Okay, so it's meant to be something that is uplifting, inspiring, and in a way it's about particularly talking about the holiness of the saint. Now, a saint is a person, who was once usually a holy person. Some saints are fictional, but most are probably real. But attached to their reputation is both their status maybe as a religious leader, as many of our Celtic saints are, but also their performance of miraculous deeds, okay, their value as an intercessionary figure, so their ability to do supernatural things. And so often the writing of a saint's life is to verify those supernatural acts, okay, to documenting of miracles. Also, as we see particularly with Irish and Welsh lives, we find also that these lives are written partly to document the privileges of the churches of those saints. So often their relationships, their entitlements, their land ownership, their roles liturgically in political life, these things are also what these lives are often about. And naturally enough, that isn't always what we would call historical information. If you want to read these lives, just in passing I should say, the life of David is quite easy to get hold of. There's a number of translations. The most recent one by Richard Sharp and John Reuben Davis in a book called St. David of Wales, edited by myself. I'm not sure you necessarily want to rush out and buy it, but I'm sure you can get your library to order it or something like that. The life of Máedóc is a bit harder to get hold of. There's a couple of the later lives are available online. The one, a late Irish life edited by Charles Plummer, is on the UCC Celt archive. It's an online site. But that's a quite different life to the early one. The earliest one is edited by Charles Plummer in a book called Vitae Sanctorum Hibernii. And till this morning, I never actually realised there is actually an English translation of it, but in a very old collection edited by William Rees called Lives of the Canberra British Saints, a not terribly good collection. Otherwise, you need to be able to read Latin, and I think, to be honest with you, one of the problems of our saints' lives in Celtic countries is where most of the ones in Irish or Welsh are rendered into English, a lot of the Latin ones are not, and it's on the rather Victorian principle that every gentleman can read Latin. But I think the problem is these were texts edited around 1900 or something, so we need to do something about that because the early lives tend to be in Latin. And the early life of Máedóc is a very interesting text, though a challenging one to interpret. But saints also have a materiality, and this is something I really want to stress, that one of the things we can resort to in understanding saints is the fact that saints are also artefacts of the landscape. And I think this is something very significant because where you have devotion, where you have the daily sensory experience of saints in rituals of devotion, where you have investment in saints as destinations of pilgrimage, as objects of shrines, you have a landscape of saints' cults as well. And the materiality of saints is often more important than the literary reality. One of the problems in my field of work is that because we deal with texts a lot of the time, we write about texts as if texts were terribly powerful. But actually most people didn't read, so texts are not that powerful. What's really powerful is where the saint is on the ground. Now this is not an ancient site necessarily, though it may be an ancient site, but what you're looking at here, the materiality in this case is, this is a holy well to St David, and it's just down the road. It's between Enniscorthy and Wexford. You turn off to the right, I forget the exact name of the village, but you can find it on the map. And actually it's a massive site. It's got this great big sort of paddock with all sorts of stuff in it, really. It shows you that when this site was decorated, back I think in the 1940s, that relationship between Ireland and Wales, between the southeast of Ireland and the southwest of Wales, was front and centre of sort of the heritage industry at that time. But also, of course, holy wells are one of those materialities. And one thing everyone knows as an archaeologist is you can move a standing stone, you can even move a church. You can't move a holy well. It might move itself, but, it stays where it is, They do get rededicated, but nothing's that settled in life, is it? Now, I'm going to illustrate the problem of saints' materiality and the reliability of information by talking about a different subject for a moment. And this is purely gratuitous because I'm from Sydney. This is a monument in a graveyard in Sydney in Australia, and something that every person in Wexford should be aware of because this is the 1798 monument in Sydney, and it is the largest 1798 monument in the world. So just a little bit of a plug for the link between Wexford and Australia, vitally important. But I just want to use it briefly to illustrate, in a way, some of the questions about saints' cults, materiality and lives, in a way that takes us out of talking about technical medieval things, so a 2-minute digression. This object was built in 1898, the centenary of the 1798 Rising, and it was built in Sydney because many of the 98 leaders, and a good number from around here, were taken to Australia as transportees after the Rising. In 1898, 100 years later, they decided to commemorate it by building this site, which is a shrine, really. It's sort of like the sanctuary of a church. It's even got a fence on the front, though that was added a bit later. They even say Mass now in the space inside, which I just think just shows you the evolution of monuments. It's covered in Irish inscriptions, including one wonderful Ogham inscription there on the side, good piece of late 19th century antiquarianism, but also other inscriptions in Irish as well. And it enshrines, under the mosaic in the foreground, the bodies of 2 Wicklow rebels, Michael Dwyer and his wife Mary Dwyer. Now, all of this is fine. These were real rebels. This is a commemoration 100 years after the event. But it's important to note that this monument does not really commemorate what happened quite in 1798. What it actually commemorates is 2 books. One, a history by a man called Patrick Fidelis Kavanagh, who'd actually lived in Sydney for some of the 19th century. He was a Franciscan who wrote a story about the 98 Rising in the Wexford and Wicklow area, mainly being a rising of sort of unpolitical peasants under the leadership of clergy against the oppression of British rule. Father Murphy, of course, being a historic character, but also the hero of that book. And I describe it a little bit as a sort of Father Ted version of history in a way, but it's also partly true. Now, this monument also commemorates a book by a man called John Thomas Campion, a book written in the 1830s, a really turgid romance about Michael Dwyer and his wife, Mary, who he called Saintly Mary of the Mountains, a tall, blushing maiden who was full of religious zeal. Now, when they relocated the bodies in 1898, because it's a shrine, it's a relic shrine, they translated the bodies of two rebels. It's like a saint's shrine. They found, in fact, that Mary's body was incorrupt, which sort of added to the quasi-saintly nature of the whole thing. They also found she was under 5 feet tall, so she wasn't any tall, blushing maiden of the mountains. But the whole monument, in a way, is a shrine both to 98 and the real story, but also particularly to this very Catholic, very romantic, and indeed also with all the Irish inscriptions, a very Gaelic vision of rebellion, which is almost nothing like the 98 Rising, which was sort of Jacobin, led by Protestants, not really anything much to do with the Irish language. So what you've got here is a mixture of the true and the fictional. You've got fictional narratives that serve contemporary politics, create a monument. But it's fair to say that even though this is a projection of a sort of pious nationalism, the Dwyers actually were probably the most pious of the transportees. They were very, very prominent figures in the Catholic Church in Australia. They weren't typical 98 rebels in that sense. And also, there is some elements of the story of Michael and Mary Dwyer that really do fit the reality. He was an amazing sort of guerrilla fighter. In many ways, Michael Dwyer was far more like, the rebels of 1916 than he was about like the rebels of 98. So I guess you could say that what you have here is the typical problem of saints cults. You have a materiality. The bodies of the rebels are an important pull in terms of the commemoration. You have the building of shrines that give a political narrative. But a really important point is that a lot of the sort of factoids in that are actually true. So the narrative builds on true roots. And I guess it symbolises something very important about the study of saints. We often get really put off by the fact that stories of saints are neither true nor false. Get over it. This is true in this case as well. That's just the way history works. But maybe that modern analogy just gives you an idea of really the same problems you have when you're dealing with the medieval material. Because they're not different problems, they're the same. Some of it's true, some of it's not. But the not true is also true of another era. It tells you other things that are important as well. And even if it isn't terribly relevant anyway, I've shown you a picture of Sydney, so we're all happy now, okay? I can go home in a good mood. Okay, do go and see it, most astounding monument. Okay, now back to St David, who's what we're really here to deal with. Okay, now I've mentioned that St David's life was written in around about 1080 to 1090 at the church at Llanbadarnfawr in mid-Wales. An easily remembered name to anyone who's ever lived in mid-Wales. It's the only McDonald's within about a 50-mile radius, so if you have young children, you always know where Llanbadarnfawr is. Back in the Middle Ages, around about the 1000s, it was the centre of a large religious community, and the titular head of that community was a family monastery, if you like, or family church. It's not a monastery exactly, they're mostly closer to what we would call a collegiate church. But the head of this was the Bishop of St David's, a man called Cillian. And Cillian is important because Cillian himself, in his youth, had studied in Ireland. And again, the story of how he studied in Ireland is another one of these typical sort of pieces of hagiography. He was supposedly accidentally blown by a gale and ended up in Ireland and stayed there. After yesterday, maybe we could well believe that those things happen, but really these are often sort of literary tropes, if you like. The context of the writing of his life I mentioned is William the Conqueror coming to West Wales, and the centrepiece of the life in a way is taking a holy man from Welsh tradition and trying to elevate him to be in his church, the church that he created, to position his church to be a rival archiepiscopal see to Canterbury. And Canterbury has come under Norman control very much as the primatial archdiocese in Britain. But here we have the Welsh trying to use the antiquity of their founder saint to argue that theirs is actually the older and the diocese with primacy. So this is a very political, contemporary political argument. But as we will see, in a way comparable to our story of the Dwyers there, it's also building upon facts that have been inherited about David that are powerful facts in their own right. Okay. One of the things about St David that's really interesting, and here I want to think about materialities, is St David has never really moved. If you compare him to St Máedóc, the centre of St Máedoc's cult, which was at Ferns in the early Middle Ages, later moved up to County Cavan to Drumlane, where the native territory of Máedóc, who was a Cavan-born saint, but this is a typical example of where a saint's family, his religious network of monasteries, if you like, his community, the headship of that relocates to another place and takes the cult with it. What's interesting about St David's is that St David's is where we think St David actually lived, and it's never actually moved. Now, something to know about this place, it's one of the finest cathedrals, Romanesque cathedrals in Britain, and I don't just say that because I'm from the area. but it's also one of the most perilous. The bottom of this valley is essentially a swamp. You can see it's a very unusual cathedral. It's down in a hole. You always know a monastic cathedral when you come across it, in origin. This was not built to be in a central place. It was built because of the power of the holy man and his cult. So it's down in the bottom of a valley. We know that often eremitical saints like to live in wet places. They like to live in remote places. This is their idea of a desert, if you like, or a retreat. Now, when it comes around to about the 1100s and they're building a cathedral on this site of this scale, replacing what was probably an earlier cathedral of much smaller scale, not all cathedrals are large, as we know when we're standing here, they found they had to build this on land that was barely there. So it's very like that castle in Monty Python and the Holy Grail that keeps falling over and sinking into the swamp. This is exactly what this place was like. When they built it in 1180, they had to rebuild the tower twice by 1247, and the former dean of the cathedral said to me that it's a daily struggle basically to keep this building standing upright because it's in such an inappropriate place. Successive Reformation bishops tried to move the cathedral. You can move a cathedral, you've got to move the bishop's chair, of course. They tried to move it to Carmarthen, which is a much more central town. Didn't succeed, because in the end, this site has the material pull, if you like. It's not just history. This is where St David's cult is centred. This is where St David was. In the Middle Ages, Welsh princes, for whom this was their central church, came to be buried here even after it passed into Norman hands, even when the border of their principalities was 30 miles to the north, because you just couldn't not be buried here. So it's always had this particular immovability, if you like, but also a very inappropriate landscape. Because David, we must say, the authentic David, if we feel we can recover this figure, was anything really but an episcopal figure. Now, our earliest references to St David come from the martyrologies written in Tala in Dublin, well, not in Dublin in those days, but the outskirts of Dublin, around about the early 800s, where David Kilmunye is the name of David. And this place where St David's is in Latin Menevia. So Kilmunye is a Hibernicization, so the Church of Munye, or the Church of Manu, Menevia in Latin, which I think means a swampy place, so pretty much on the same theme. So he made his way into Irish martyrologies by the 800s, and these are some of the very possibly the earliest references to David. Now, where we're talking about here, just briefly to put you in the picture, I assume not every Irish person necessarily has Welsh geography on their mind. St David's right out on the point here. David himself, probably from Ceredigion up here. His earliest education at Hain Venue over here. Hain Venue means Old Menevia, Old Menu. Okay, and this is the monastery we suspect he was originally educated at. And the main event in his life, the famous Synod of Llanddewi Brefi, or Brevi, happened over here. So this is the geography we'll be talking about. Llanddewi Brefi is an interesting place. I'll show you a picture in a minute. It's a church with a very early inscription to St David, and clearly a very significant site. I always like to say if it was in Ireland, it'd be like Glendalough and have a huge visitors centre. When you go to Llanddewi Brefi, there's not much to see, except if you are any of you fans of Little Britain. Anyone watch the TV show Little Britain? David, the only gay in the village, lives in Llanddewi Brefi, and you can buy a T-shirt from the local shop, I think, about that. So that's what it does for a visitor centre there. And a whole lot of signboards, which I put up myself, but that's another matter. Not personally, but I wrote them. Okay, so these are the main locations. So David is a saint of the southwest, and you can see, in a way, of course, he fits very nicely the EU funding pattern of being the other side of the water from Wexford. Very considerate of him, really, but there you are. David's reputation, particularly, as I say, is not as a sort of secular religious leader, but as a monk. And let's be clear about this, a monk who really wasn't exactly the life and soul of the party. In the life of David, by Frigavach, we're told that Frigavach, he says himself, he went down to David's own monastery, which we assume to be in this valley here, and he went through very ancient books in very old script, so eaten away by worms, he said, that you could barely read them. I hope he wore a face mask or something, it must be very bad for the lungs. But he said he found in these documents that were relevant. I think one thing he must have found was a monastic rule. And David Dumville and earlier John Morris have argued that this monastic rule is the same rule, probably quoted by the British churchman Gildas, who's a contemporary of David, who gives us passages of a letter, a passage of a letter survived between him and a British monk called Finian, who was living in Ireland. And he talks about these monks he sees as excessively zealous. So he says, "These, while they eat bread by measure, glory on that account beyond measure. While they use water, they drink at the same time of the cup of hatred. They take their enjoyment simultaneously of dry dishes and of backbiting." And he seems to be referring either to a particular monastic leader who had a particularly austere form of monasticism, or maybe to a movement. But Dumville has argued, and I'm inclined to agree strongly with this, that he's talking about David himself, that this is David anonymously appearing in a 6th century document. In the life of David, written by Frigg of Arc then, 500 years later, he seems to have something of the same thing that Gildas was reading. Now, he thinks it's a good thing, where Gildas thinks it's a bad thing. And he's saying, they gather at table, everyone relieves his weary limbs by partaking of dinner, but not to excess. For being filled to excess, even when bread on its own gives rise to dissipation, they quench their burning thirst with a temperate kind of drink. I do love the idea of someone who thinks that eating bread to excess can fill you full of lust and dissipation. I know my daughter eats too much toast, I should say that to her, leads to dissipation. Okay. So, in a way, we seem to have here a contemporary witness, we could be having a contemporary witness to what's going on in the David world, as you might say, in the 500s. And David isn't really a sort of public, holy figure leading people. He's living away in a valley and he's, let's face it, eating bread and water. And there's more as well. He stands up to his neck in water and sort of stifles bodily lusts. And if you look at the water around there, they wouldn't take me long to do that. But anyway, okay. I mean, it wouldn't take long to get out of the water and say I had enough of that dissipation. Okay, so David then is a very powerful holy man, and his cult is built around, if you like, not only the facts of that holiness that might be denigrated by some of his contemporaries, but may be admirable to many people, and also the physical existence of his cult in a place that is opposite to that kind of life, which is a remote place, a wet and an inaccessible place. Now, the life of David, however, builds two stories about David. One of them is this image of David as an early monk, a person of excessive holiness, and in that section we have a series of references to Irish saints, in which St. Máedóc, for example, turns up. And you might say that this part of the life points towards Ireland, the monastic David. But suddenly in the middle of the life it goes the other way. He goes to a synod at Llanddewi Brevi and he's elevated to the archiepiscopate. And then when the life points the other way, it points towards England and East Wales. So it's very clear that what you have in this life is not just a fiction of contemporary nature. You have a writer in the form of Frigg of Arc dealing with a somewhat uncooperative saint, a saint whose persona is not very political. It's not very much to do with secular politics. And so there are two Davids in this life. There's the David who is holy, and then the David who's sort of pointed by God to being a leader of the secular church. And this happens at Llanddewi Brevi, this site in mid Wales, where on a great mound, possibly an artificial mound, it's never been excavated, we have this church, and it's on the site where the ground allegedly rose up under David's feet. Every school child in Wales seems to know this story. It's one of those indelible memories. As he preached, his voice reached out to the extent of the multitude gathered there. 118 British bishops all gathered in probably the most remote town in Britain almost, a village in Britain, but a little more accessible maybe in those days. It is on a Roman road anyway. But this idea then that the ground rose up under his feet, and this holy man, this reluctant holy man, who hadn't even come to the synod, had been walking down the road, became the Archbishop of the British. A political myth very much of the Norman period, pre-Norman period. But on the other hand, Crig of Art could never take the other story out. That this is in a way a set of facts or factoids about David that could never be taken away. And is also evinced by the material character of his church itself. Now, all of this is tied up, as I say, with the fact that there is a sequence I would call the Irish sequence, a series of references to Irish saints in the life of St. David. And these have characteristics in them that are also linked to the earliest life of Máedóc. Some of them crop up in the stories about Máedóc in that are closely related. I think the author of one life knew the other life, though it's not clear which is which. But these Irish saints are all saints that feature in the life. We have Patrick and Alva, two of the really big figures in Ireland. Also, these other saints who are more parochial, Máedóc, Scotheen, Modovnog, who I'll finish up by talking about in a moment. St. Brendan, a sort of really international figure, but particularly in terms of communications and the idea of travel on the sea. Now, how these saints' cults got there is an interesting question. My belief is that all of these are there already, for reasons I will note very briefly. The part of Wales we are talking about here has long had connections to Ireland. In the late Iron Age or the very early medieval period, maybe the first centuries AD, we have definitely Irish settlement. There's Irish-speaking, Irish people in this area in that period, maybe from around 100 to 400 AD, maybe a bit later. When it enters recorded history at the end of the Roman period, we find a considerable Irishness to this kingdom. This is known as Dyfed in the southeast. These Ogham stones, or Ogham stones, are often bilingual in Latin script and in Irish script. There's one on the right, wrong button. One on the right here from Llanwenog, just up there. A good example, except only not a good example in one sense, in that this is actually made of fiberglass. The real stone is in the British Museum, but it's photographed better than any of the others. You see, study of all these things is always a little bit of a fiction, even my PowerPoint. Okay, but this Irish speaking is well attested in this area by place names, by bilingual inscriptions, whether by everybody or just by an aristocracy, but clearly there was Irish settlement in this area in the late prehistoric period. So in a way, this is sort of mini Scotland. It's another place in which the Irish have crossed the sea and have settled in Britain, the only difference being that the settlements don't come into the modern era still speaking Irish. And there are many sites where we have Irish saints who we have no record of really, but are commemorated in names. This chapel in Pembrokeshire, St Govern's Chapel, very photographic and photogenic, you might say, where a saint is originally meant to have lived in this cave, where that rock is to the right there. St Govan, clearly an Irish name in origin, but we don't know much about this otherwise. Now, one of the problems is working out how the settlements of saints, the settlements of Irish people, on the other hand, or of Irish saints' cults, relate to any actual historic activity. If we go back maybe a century, or in this case perhaps not that so far, often a very Victorian and Edwardian way of looking at it was to think about the travels of saints. And our saints sort of moved around on the map in what I sort of call sort of Dad's Army maps. You remember, it was in the TV show Dad's Army with a little map with the arrow going across at the beginning, like that. And so in a way, all these things were depicted as if these were big movements, as if saints or settlement groups or whatever they may be, always represented invasions in a way. And it kind of makes this into a stop-start story that it probably shouldn't be, because you can cross the Irish Sea at any time pretty much, except yesterday perhaps, but it's not really very far. And I think contact between these places has probably been pretty much continuous. But it's a sort of disease of scholarship to sometimes try to break it down into very simple periods. So some people have thought that the Irish saints' cults we're talking about just came over in that early period of Dyfed. I doubt that. I think there's a lot more going on. The very early Welsh poem, Amas Pryden Vow, the great prophecy of Britain, probably written in the 10th century, gives a very interesting perspective upon saints' cults in the Irish Sea. It suggests that the cult of David could become a rallying point not just for the Welsh, so now our national saint, but indeed a rallying point for all of those who stand against the English all around the shores of the Irish Sea. Now, this is a political claim specific to its time, and I'm not going to glorify it with any further detail, except to say, instead of thinking of it in those terms, what we can at least say is that the people in this period were not necessarily thinking of politics in the way we think of them, that they're thinking about ethnic groups who are around the shores of the sea, who are probably more in communication with each other across that sea than they are necessarily with other people on their same land masses. You know, roads were not that good in those days. Also, dynasties that are intermarried between Wales and Ireland. In other words, that there is a different conception of politics. And here we have at least one case where David is already becoming a pan-national figure or a supranational figure, coming quite early on, even well before the Norman period. So again, the periodisation of these things just to the early Middle Ages, the time of David or the time of the Normans, can neglect the fact that there's always things going back and forth. Now, I haven't got much more time available, but I'll just point up a few interesting things that arise out of looking at these cults, and also indulge myself just ever so slightly in sort of telling you about the nerdy things that I think are interesting in these comparisons. One of the things about the Irish sequence in the life of St. David is what it tells you about dialogue between the two churches, not in the actual stories of the saints themselves going back and forth, which are often fairly unbelievable. Máedóc is said to have walked on water halfway across the Irish Sea because of his affection for David. Another time he travelled in a chariot on the Irish Sea, which again is a highly metaphorical thing at best. But certainly in these stories we find a considerable attempt to make David the patron of Máedóc from the Welsh side, which may be a bit of political one-upmanship. On the Irish side, perhaps the desire to talk about the connectivity between the British Church and the Irish Church, possibly for reasons of creating some form of religious dignity or some conversation about the sources of monasticism, but particularly perhaps David's inherent holiness. Whatever the cause, what is interesting about these narratives is also that they link into other literary connections that seem to me to be vitally important for our subject, one of which is a lot of these journeys back and forth across the Irish Sea in these stories tie in, interestingly, not only to Latin literature, but even possibly to vernacular literature. There's a series of stories about sea beasts in this section of Frigavark's life that are replicated also in the life of Máedóc that give us some very interesting insights in the origin of the legend of St. Brendan, a topic of more than passing interest in literary terms. And even in Máedóc travelling on the sea in a chariot, a very powerful connection to the early Irish tale Imre of Bran MacFebble, the story, the Voyage of Bran, probably one of our earliest Irish literary narratives. So there's a lot of material in these lives, stuck away unfortunately in Latin texts that aren't very widely accessible, that could shed significant light upon how our literary genres have come into being in Irish as well as in Welsh, but I've not got time to say more about that. But also, there are ways in which the study of the saints in these lives also give us some insights into how we might start to build chronologies about these contacts. And one case study that interests me is the case studies of where we have these Irish saints in the life of St. David by Frigavark, that I mentioned, having already pre-existing cults in Wales. And some of these, for example, at White Sands near St. David's, we now have an early chronology for the chapel at White Sands that takes us well back into the period before Frigavark's life. Other sites, such as St. Elvis, I've got to mention St. Elvis because the Irish saint Alva becomes Elvis in Welsh. And did you know Elvis Presley actually had a Welsh grandmother? So you never know. I'm not sure the name really came. It could be really St. Alva Presley, you never know. That'd be a good one for the... Okay, this site at Llantlir interests me particularly because it's a good example of where we can see the backstory of these exchanges perhaps going on. Because here we have this very interesting pillar stone from about the 9th century, which describes the gift of a religious site to one of the saints named in the life of St. David. Not Máedóc, unfortunately, but another saint who at least has an arguably religious name. Because this name here, Moedóc, here in a Welsh form, Modom Noaco, so it's Canberra-sized, but it preserves that same structure we have with the life of Máedóc. It has the prefix mo and a diminutive suffix. So he's really Domnach, probably originally, Dominicus in Latin, a saint from Leinster, but now given this we call a hyperchoristic name, this pet name. And he's an example. This is because we have so few literary records before the time of Frigavark in Wales. This monument is a good example of where taking our journey into non-narrative sources or semi-narrative sources allows us to shed light upon what is old and what is new in those narratives. And a good look at comparing the archaeological, the epigraphic evidence with these literary sources gives us ways of breaking open what is literature and what is fiction, what is history, what is fiction in these texts. Because the alternative otherwise is we often reduce these texts mainly to being artefacts of their own time, where, much as possible, we would like to know how much further we can go with the data in them into the past. Okay, so in conclusion, I want to convey a few points, and the key points, I suppose, are this. We have texts about these saints, the lives of St. David, the lives of Máedóc, that we used to read maybe as stories, and there is a heritage tradition that would say, put the story up and let people wander around the site and they'll find connections. But in a way, that doesn't do much justice to what is historical in those sources. And what I suppose I've given some examples here, I hope they've been comprehensible, is of how in a way we sift what is contemporary politics in the writing of these texts, which of course is an interesting study in its own right, and what is older, what is perhaps information that even if it isn't authentic information about the saint, is at least authentic information about how the saint was perceived earlier on. It's authentic information about earlier periods. What we see in sites such as the inscription from Llantlir, or in works like Armes Prydain Fawr, or indeed in some of the earlier layers we can pull out of the lives themselves by comparing them across a range of literary sources, is the ability to get us a layer or two further down into the tradition, to get us into those periods that in Wales particularly, but also in Ireland, are almost ahistorical at times. And a dialogue between the materiality of the cult of the saint, which for saints is a very real thing. Saints are big on sort of making a material footprint. And these saints' lives that are awkward. They're not necessarily fiction, they're not necessarily history, but they're full of things we find scarcely believable, but are fascinating stories. But we can go into those lives with a new perspective in a way and say, yes, we can write the history the lives will tell us, will let us write, and we'll write it in a way where we can say what we can say, and we won't put them into a world in which they're either just political fiction of a later date or simply a sort of pious narrative that does not relate to anything that we can relate to ourselves. So I hope that sort of maps a little bit of a roadmap for some of those questions, and at least I've shown you some attractive pictures. And I finish then by noting St. David's well, our two saints together, and the very interesting perspective that gives us on how people in the past saw the world before they only could go through an airport in Dublin and an airport in Cardiff, but when they saw the world from the sea, and when both sides of this Irish Sea, occasional days like yesterday aside, when the sea was in that role was a connecting force rather than a separating one. And I hope that is a good theme anyway to take us forward also in developing the heritage both of County Wexford and of the adjacent parts of Wales. Thank you very much for your time.